There is a study, and it is not a metaphor, it is an actual laboratory study published in Science in 2014, where researchers placed people alone in a room with nothing to do for 15 minutes. No phone, no book, no music, just a chair, 4 walls, and a small button connected to a mild electric shock. 2/3 of men and 1/4 of women chose to shock themselves rather than sit in silence. Let that settle for a moment, because we're not talking about people in distress. We're talking about ordinary volunteers who walked into a university building on an ordinary afternoon, agreed to participate in a study, and then, faced with nothing but themselves and 15 minutes of quiet, decided that physical pain was preferable. Not boredom, not discomfort, pain. And here is where the question that will follow you through this entire video begins to take shape. Not as a philosophical abstraction, but as something uncomfortably personal. What is it about silence that makes modern humans choose suffering over stillness? I'm not going to answer that yet. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because answering it too early would be the same mistake you make every time silence arrives in your life, filling it before you've actually felt what it contains. What I will tell you is this: silence is not empty. It never was. The reason it feels unbearable to most people over 45, people who have built careers, raised children, survived losses, accumulated enough life to fill several books, is precisely because silence is full. Dangerously, uncomfortably, terrifyingly full, not of noise, of you. And somewhere between the person you were at 25 and the person reading these words right now, something happened. You learned, without anyone teaching you explicitly, that the fastest way to not feel certain things was to never stop moving, never stop producing, never let the room go quiet. This is not a video about meditation. It is not about mindfulness or breathwork or any of the 1,000 repackaged versions of ancient practices that promise you calm in exchange for a subscription. This is an investigation into why silence has been treated as sacred and as punishment across every civilization that ever existed. Into what neuroscience now tells us happens in the brain when external input disappears. Into why the most honest philosophers in history didn't prescribe silence as a solution. They identified it as a confrontation. And into what specifically you have been running from. You already know the answer, by the way. That's the terrifying part. You just haven't been in a quiet enough room to hear it. Blaise Pascal was a 17th century French mathematician and theologian, a man who helped invent the mechanical calculator, contributed foundational work to probability theory, and spent the final years of his life writing fragments of thought that would be published after his death under the title Pensée, which simply means thoughts. In one of those fragments, he wrote something so precise that it reads less like philosophy and more like a diagnosis. He wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." 1654. No smartphones, no streaming platforms, no notification badges accumulating on the corner of a screen. And Pascal had already identified the central disease, which means this is not a modern problem. It is a human problem. But here is where it gets more interesting than a quote on a motivational poster, because Pascal wasn't making a moral argument. He wasn't telling you that you should sit quietly, the way a coach tells you that you should exercise. He was making an observational claim, that the inability to tolerate one's own company in stillness is the engine behind most of what goes wrong in human life. Wars, distraction, accumulation, status chasing, the relentless manufacturing of noise in every available form. Not symptoms of a broken society, symptoms of a species that cannot face itself. Now bring this forward 3.5 centuries, and the science catches up to what Pascal intuited. Your nervous system, and I mean this literally, not metaphorically, your nervous system is built to treat silence as a potential threat. The technical term for the part of this system that governs your threat response is the sympathetic nervous system, which is the branch responsible for what most people know as the fight or flight response. Here's what most people don't know. That system is activated not just by danger, but by uncertainty. And silence, to a brain shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, registers as uncertainty. When the sounds of the environment disappear, the brain doesn't think, rest. The brain thinks, why has everything gone quiet? In the ancient world, that question had a very practical answer. Silence in a forest meant a predator was close. The birds stop singing before something moves through the underbrush. The insects go quiet before a storm. Silence was data, and the data it carried was almost always a warning. Your brain never fully unlearned that, which means every time you reach for your phone the moment a conversation ends, every time you turn on a podcast before you've even started the car, every time you fill a Sunday afternoon with errands that could wait, you are not being lazy or distracted or weak. You are being perfectly, efficiently, evolutionarily rational, and that is precisely the problem. Because the threats are gone, but the response remains. And in the absence of actual predators, your nervous system has found something else to treat as dangerous. Your own thoughts, more specifically, the thoughts that only surface when everything else goes quiet. The assessments, the reckonings, the questions that don't have comfortable answers. The version of yourself that exists underneath the role you play at work, underneath the identity you've constructed for the people who know your name. There is a specific pattern to the way this escape operates, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It doesn't look like avoidance, it looks like productivity, it looks like responsibility, it looks like staying informed, staying connected, staying useful, not rest. Productive rest, not quiet. Purposeful quiet, meaning quiet with a podcast or quiet with a plan, or quiet with enough low-grade stimulation that the real silence never actually arrives. The escape is almost always disguised as engagement. And this raises the question that will carry us into the next layer of this investigation. If the avoidance is this sophisticated, if it has learned to wear the costume of virtue, then what exactly is it protecting you from? Because here's what this reveals, and it is not comfortable. The architecture of your daily life may have been built, at least in part, around the careful engineering of your own distraction. This explains the pattern, but it creates a larger problem. If the noise in your life is not accidental, if it is in some meaningful sense chosen, then silence isn't just an absence of sound, it is a decision, one you have been postponing. Here is something that should unsettle you, because it unsettled me when I first traced it across the timeline of human history. Every major civilization, without exception, without a single gap in the record, developed a formal relationship with silence, not casually, formally, institutionally, as if silence were a territory that required a map, a guide, a set of rules for navigation. And the remarkable thing is not that they all agreed on what silence was. The remarkable thing is that they were all afraid of it in exactly the same way. In the 4th century, a group of Christian monks and nuns withdrew into the Egyptian and Syrian deserts to live in radical solitude. We call them the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the Abbas and Ammas, which are simply the Aramaic words for father and mother. They left the cities of the late Roman Empire not to escape society, but to confront something they believed could only be found in the complete absence of distraction. They called it hesychia, a Greek word meaning stillness, quiet, rest. But in their usage, it meant something far more demanding than any of those English translations suggest. It meant the cessation of interior noise, not just external silence, but the silencing of the compulsive mental commentary that runs beneath every waking moment. And what did they find there? Not peace. Not first, anyway. They found what they called exedia, a Greek term that has no perfect modern equivalent, but which translates roughly as a spiritual torpor, a restless inability to remain present, a creeping despair that arrived specifically in the middle of the day, in the heat, when the silence was at its most total. The noonday demon, they called it. And the description of acedia, written in the desert in the 4th century by men and women who had no television, no internet, no economy of distraction, reads almost identically to what contemporary psychologists now call existential anxiety. The experience of confronting the self in its unmediated form is not a modern invention. It is an ancient emergency. Move forward 11 centuries, and you find a different civilization arriving at the same territory from a completely different direction. In Japan, the Zen Buddhist tradition developed zazen, seated meditation, not as a relaxation technique, but as a deliberate confrontation with what they called mur, a word that resists clean translation, but gestures toward emptiness, nothingness, the void that exists when conceptual thinking is stripped away. Zen masters did not promise their students that sitting in silence would feel good. They promised it would feel like dying. That was considered an accurate description, not a deterrent. The Quakers, emerging in 17th century England, built their entire theology around communal silence. Their worship services contained no sermon, no liturgy, no appointed leader, just people sitting together, waiting for what they called the inner light, the direct, unmediated experience of the divine that they believed could only be heard when every human voice had stopped. George Fox, the founder of the movement, described silence not as a spiritual practice, but as the only honest response to the scale of what he believed was being missed in all the noise of organized religion. Silence for Fox was not a technique, it was an accusation. Now here is where the trajectory bends in a direction that nobody in the 4th century desert or 17th century England could have anticipated. 1951. A composer named John Cage walks into an anechoic chamber at Harvard University, a room engineered to absorb all reflected sound, designed to be as close to total silence as physics permits. He expected to hear nothing. He heard two sounds. When he asked the engineer about them afterward, the engineer explained, the high sound was his nervous system in operation. The low sound was his blood circulating. Cage came out of that room and concluded something that reoriented the rest of his artistic life. There is no such thing as silence, not because the world is always making noise, but because you are always making noise. The body itself is a sound. The mind itself is a frequency. 3 years later, he composed 433, a piece in which a pianist sits at a piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and plays nothing. The audience, initially confused and then increasingly uncomfortable, provides the music. The coughs, the rustling programs, the distant traffic, the sound of people trying desperately to behave as if nothing unusual is happening. The piece was not about silence. It was about what we do when silence arrives. And what we do almost universally is fill it, which brings us to the laboratory and to what happens in the brain when the filling stops. The default mode network, the DMN, a constellation of brain regions that becomes active specifically when you're not focused on any external task, was not formally identified until the early 2000s, when neuroscientist Marcus Raichley and his colleagues noticed something strange in brain imaging data. They had expected the brain to go quiet when subjects weren't doing anything. Instead, a specific network lit up with intense activity. The brain does not rest when the world goes quiet. It turns inward. And what it does when it turns inward is something that took researchers years to fully characterize, because it is not simple and it is not comfortable. The default mode network is associated with self-referential thinking, with the construction and maintenance of personal narrative, with the mental simulation of future scenarios, with the processing of social relationships, and with what psychologists call autobiographical memory consolidation, the ongoing project of making sense of who you are based on what you have lived. In plain language, when the noise stops, your brain starts asking the hard questions, not randomly, systematically. Who am I, separate from what I do? What have I actually built? And does it mean what I told myself it meant? How much of the life I am living was chosen, and how much was simply the path of least resistance through a series of circumstances I never fully examined? These are not pathological questions. They are the most important questions a human being can ask. And they arrive reliably and without invitation in silence, which is why silence has never been neutral. Not in the desert, not in the Zen monastery, not in the Quaker meeting house, not in the anechoic chamber at Harvard, not in the university room with the electric shock button. Every civilization that ever encountered silence knew it was not empty. Every civilization that ever encountered silence knew it was not empty. They disagreed violently about what it contained. And that disagreement, sustained across 4,000 years of recorded human thought, is itself the evidence. You do not build temples around emptiness. You do not send monks into deserts to confront nothing. You do not compose 4 minutes and 33 seconds of staged quiet and call it music, unless what lives inside silence is something significant enough to require that kind of careful, deliberate framing. The terrifying theory is beginning to take shape. But it has one more layer, and this one lands closer to home than any desert monastery or Harvard laboratory. Because the question that closes this block is not historical, it is personal. If every tradition that ever studied silence agreed that what you find there is yourself, and if neuroscience now confirms that the brain turns inward the moment external input disappears, then the real question is not, what is silence? The real question is, what are you afraid you'll find? That question doesn't close here. It only gets more specific from this point forward. Let me describe a scene, and I want you to measure how familiar it feels. You finish something, doesn't matter what, a work call, a meal, a conversation with someone you love. The task ends. The other person leaves the room or hangs up the phone, and for a fraction of a second, a window so brief you might not even register it consciously, there is silence. Then, almost immediately, something reaches. Your hand moves toward the phone before the thought forms. The television turns on not because you want to watch anything specific, but because the quiet was already starting to feel like pressure. You find a task, a small one, something practical, something that justifies the movement, and you step into it the way you'd step out of a cold room. The whole sequence takes less than 90 seconds, and here is what is important to understand about those 90 seconds. They are not random. They are not weakness. They are a trained response, so well rehearsed, so deeply grooved into the architecture of your daily life that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like thirst, like a natural corrective, like the body simply doing what bodies do. But it is a choice. It has always been a choice. The pattern has a specific shape, and once you see the shape, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't recognize it. It begins with completion, the moment a task or interaction ends. Then comes what psychologists call an interoceptive signal, which simply means the body's awareness of its own internal state. Something shifts, a mild discomfort rises. Not pain, not grief, something subtler, a low-grade unease, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing. And then the reach. The reach is almost always dressed in something reasonable. You check the news because you like to stay informed. You start a podcast because you enjoy learning. You scroll because you're resting. The content almost doesn't matter. What matters is the interruption of the signal. The discomfort was rising, the reach cut it off, and the system returns to equilibrium. This is not a character flaw. It is an extraordinarily efficient regulatory mechanism. The problem is what it's regulating. Because the discomfort that rises in those 90 seconds of silence is not random static. It is information. Specifically, it is the information that your brain was about to begin processing. The material from the default mode network that only surfaces when external demands disappear. The unresolved question from 3 weeks ago. The relationship dynamic you've been meaning to think about more carefully. The sense, low and persistent, that something in your life is slightly misaligned with something you've never quite been able to name. Not crisis, not breakdown. Just truth in its most inconvenient timing. And here is the specific pattern I want you to look at, because this is where the personal application stops being general and starts being about the particular mathematics of a life that has reached the kind of scale yours has. If you are in your mid-40s, 50s or beyond, the calculus of this avoidance has changed in a way that younger people cannot fully understand because they haven't lived long enough to feel the specific weight of it. When you are 25, the noise you generate is mostly forward-facing. You're building, planning, projecting. The distraction is oriented toward a future that still feels wide open. The silence you avoid is uncomfortable, yes, but it's the discomfort of uncertainty, of not yet knowing who you'll become. That is a bearable kind of silence to avoid. But at 45, at 55, at 65, the silence that arrives in those 90 seconds is not asking about the future. It is asking about the past, and that is an entirely different confrontation. Because the past is fixed, you cannot revise it, cannot optimize it, cannot manage your way back through it. The silence that arrives in the second half of a life is carrying a specific and unanswerable question, and your nervous system knows it, which is why the reach happens faster, and why the distractions tend to run deeper, and why the people who are most relentlessly busy are so often the people who have the most to look back at. Not failure, not regret necessarily, just weight. The accumulated weight of a life actually lived. Here is the pattern in its plainest form. The more life you have behind you, the more the silence contains. And the more the silence contains, the more sophisticated your avoidance becomes. The busyness starts to look like wisdom. The constant engagement starts to look like vitality. The refusal to slow down starts to feel like the one thing standing between you and something you can't quite name, but sense. The way you sense weather before it arrives. There is a name for what you sense. We'll get to it. But first to the moment where this pattern breaks open. Because there is always a moment. Sometimes it's chosen. More often it's imposed. A surgery that requires weeks of stillness. A loss that empties the house. A retirement that removes the last reliable source of structured noise. A weekend alone unexpectedly when everyone else has somewhere to be. The external scaffolding of sound drops away, and for the first time in years, sometimes for the first time in decades, the silence arrives without an exit. And what happens in that silence is not what you expected. It is not peaceful, not first. It is loud. Extraordinarily, specifically, personally loud, with everything you have been carefully, efficiently, reasonably not hearing. You can learn to recognize the pattern. You can trace its shape in your own daily life with almost clinical precision once you know what to look for. But learning the pattern and surviving what you find when you stop feeding it, those are two completely different skills. And the second one requires something that no amount of self-awareness alone can provide, which is where this investigation has to go deeper. There is a theological tradition called apophatic theology, sometimes called negative theology, though that translation loses something important. And its central premise is so counterintuitive that most people in the Western world, trained in the tradition of positive definition, struggle to take it seriously when they first encounter it. The tradition holds that God, or ultimate reality, or the ground of being, choose whatever term creates the least resistance, cannot be described by saying what it is. It can only be approached by systematically removing every description of what it is not. You don't define the truth. You clear away every false layer until what remains cannot be cleared. The tradition stretches from the 5th century Christian mystic known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote that the divine is beyond being, beyond knowledge, beyond any concept the human mind can construct, through the Jewish philosopher Maimonides in the 12th century, through the Islamic Sufi tradition, through Meister Eckhart in the 14th century, all the way to certain strands of contemporary philosophy of mind. I bring this up not to make a theological argument. I bring it up because the same logic applies to you, not as a metaphor, as a structural observation. The self you present to the world, the one with the job title and the opinions and the carefully maintained sense of how things should go, that self is almost entirely a construction of positive definition. You know who you are because of what you do, what you've built, what you believe, what you've survived, how others describe you when you leave the room. You are the sum of your noise. And here is the problem that apophatic theology illuminates with uncomfortable precision. A self that is entirely defined by its contents, by its activities, its roles, its accumulated positions on things, is a self that cannot survive the removal of those contents, which is exactly what silence removes. Not gradually, not gently, immediately. The moment the noise stops, the constructed self loses its primary source of confirmation. There is no task to perform, no role to inhabit, no external signal reflecting back who you are and whether you're doing it correctly. And into that gap, that sudden, vertiginous absence of confirmation, something rises that most people spend their entire adult lives learning not to feel. The neuroscience gives this a name that is far less poetic, but considerably more precise. The default mode network, which we encountered in the previous block, does not simply turn inward when external demands disappear. It begins running what researchers describe as a self-referential processing loop, a continuous, largely involuntary review of personal narrative, social standing, future simulation, and what neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman calls mentalizing, which is the brain's attempt to model the mental states of others in relation to yourself. In plain language, the moment you stop doing things, your brain begins auditing you, not cruelly, not with any intent, simply because that is what brains do in the absence of external direction. They turn to the most complex and unresolved problem in their environment, and for a human being that problem is always the same. The problem is you. Your relationships and whether they mean what you've told yourself they mean. Your choices and whether they were actually chosen or simply defaulted into. Your beliefs and whether you still hold them or are simply maintaining them out of a loyalty to the person who formed them decades ago. A person you may no longer entirely be. This is the self-referential loop, and it is not comfortable. But here is what makes it genuinely terrifying rather than merely uncomfortable, and this is the second peak of this investigation. The place where everything that came before converges into something you cannot unknow. The self that feels threatened by silence is not your real self. It is the performance. Blaise Pascal understood this intuitively in 1654 when he wrote about the inability to sit quietly in a room. He wasn't diagnosing laziness or moral weakness. He was identifying something far more structurally significant, that human beings have developed an entire civilization, with its commerce and its politics and its entertainment and its wars, as an elaborate collective project of avoiding the one confrontation that cannot be outsourced or delegated. The confrontation with what you are when you are nothing in particular. The Zen tradition calls this confrontation kensho, a word meaning, roughly, seeing one's nature. But the translation softens something that the original context does not. In Zen pedagogy, kensho is not described as pleasant. It is described as a rupture, a collapse of the ordinary sense of self, the one built from roles and histories and carefully maintained self-concepts, followed by something that cannot be described in the language of the ordinary sense of self, because that language was part of what collapsed. The Desert Fathers called it kenosis, self-emptying. The Sufi tradition called it fana, annihilation of the ego. The Quakers called it dying to self. The language changes across every tradition. The geography of the experience they're describing does not. They are all describing the same encounter, and they are all unanimous on one point, which is the most important point in this entire investigation. The encounter cannot happen in noise, not because noise is evil or distraction is a moral failing, but because the constructed self, the performed, narrated, role-maintaining version of you, can only persist through continuous input. It needs the stimulation the way a fire needs oxygen. Remove the input, and the performance loses its stage. What remains when the stage disappears is the question that every tradition, every philosopher, every neuroscientist who has studied the resting brain has been circling for as long as human beings have been paying attention to themselves. And here is what makes it terrifying, rather than merely philosophical. You already know what remains. You have always known. There have been moments, brief, unguarded, usually accidental, when the noise dropped for a second longer than you planned, and something came through. On a long drive alone when the podcast ended, and you didn't reach for the phone immediately. In the minutes before sleep, when the day's momentum finally exhausted itself. In the strange stillness that follows a significant loss, when the usual noise feels suddenly obscene and falls away on its own. In those moments, something looked back, not frightening, not broken, not the catastrophe you'd been quietly bracing for, just present, quiet, older than any of your roles, unbothered by any of your achievements, unimpressed by any of your justifications. The mystics called it the ground of being. The neuroscientists call it baseline consciousness. The philosophers of mind call it pure subjectivity. Pascal, in his more honest moments, called it what it actually is. The one thing a human being cannot manufacture, cannot lose, and cannot successfully hide from forever. The self beneath the self. Not a poetic concept, a structural reality. And here is the disturbance that this creates. The thing that makes the terrifying theory actually terrifying, rather than merely interesting as an intellectual proposition. If the self beneath the self is real, and if it is accessible only in silence, and if you have spent years, possibly decades, engineering your life to ensure that silence never fully arrives, then the life you have been living, in its most honest accounting, has been organized around the avoidance of your own existence. Not your death, not your failures, not your regrets. Your existence, the raw, unnarrated, unperformed fact of being you. This is not pessimism. It does not lead to despair, and I want to be precise about that, because this is the point where an investigation like this can veer into a kind of philosophical theater that mistakes darkness for depth. The recognition that you have been avoiding yourself is not a verdict. It is a door. The only question is whether you are willing to stop running long enough to see what's on the other side of it. But this raises the problem that closes this block. And it is a real problem, not a rhetorical one. Knowing that the door exists does not mean you know how to open it. And opening it does not mean you know how to remain in what you find there without immediately reaching for the nearest available noise. The theory is now complete. The investigation has its answer. But the answer, as always with the most important answers, creates a question more demanding than the one it resolved. The question is not,